A lot to talk about today. First on Israel. This from the end of November, November 24th, Israel signed an agreement with Morocco when the Israeli Defense Minister Benny Gantz traveled to Morocco. And this deal laid out increased, intelligence and military cooperation and was supposed to lay the groundwork for deeper defense commitments, and that includes weapon sales from Israel to Morocco. And then within a week on November 30th, we had the announcement from an Israeli reporter, I believe, that Morocco bought unmanned suicide drones from an Israeli aerospace company for $22 million. And so just, for a little bit of context on it, this is happening as a part of the Abraham Accords. If people will remember, towards the end of the Trump administration, desperate for a foreign policy win, they look to get different Arab or Muslim countries to normalize relations with Israel and ignore the plight of the Palestinians, which is one of the causes that the Arab states had previously said was their reason for not normalizing ties with Israel. And so rather than the US pushing Israel to improve humanitarian conditions and treatment of the Palestinians, the US said to the UAE, we'll sell you F-35s and armed drones if you normalize ties with Israel. And the UAE went for this. For Morocco, the US recognized the Moroccan occupation of the Western Sahara. There's, this is an area that I'm not super read up on, but my understanding is there's like 500,000 people in a territory that is known as Western Sahara, that's somewhat stateless, I guess, ambiguous as to who would or is the internationally recognized government there. But the Moroccan government essentially occupies it and subjects these people to poverty and everything like that. And so maybe the suicide drones would be used for that. And some people have compared this to the situation in Palestine. I really don't know enough about it to say for sure, but I do feel pretty comfortable saying that, Morocco commits human rights abuses against at least some of the people in Western Sahara, and certainly wouldn't want to be a government that you're arming. And this is part of the U.S. Abraham Accords that facilitated this, and why, at the time on the show, I wasn't, going along with so much, even of the independent media that was saying these Abraham Accords are some great thing, that it's peace deals in the Middle East and things like that. And I was saying, no, these aren't diplomatic deals. These are essentially weapon sales. At the very best, they create arms races, because after the U.S. agreed to sell the UAE F-35s, then Israel said, well, you have to sell us more advanced technology because we have to have a qualified military edge over all the other Gulf Arab states. And, this is enshrined in like U.S. law and all that. And so this has actually created more weapon sales, not more peace, and just more examples of it here. Some of the biggest news around Israel over the past month and a half, I guess now, has been the NSO group and its Pegasus spyware. Now, I'm sure people in the independent media were very familiar with this and have been discussed on the show over the past couple of years. But there's been, just scandal after scandal where this spyware has been used by several companies or countries, and governments to spy on journalists, dissidents, activists, opposition, even Americans. And that's, what I think finally caused the U.S. to sanction the NSO group and really start to the avalanche of news that we've gotten about how serious this is. And so in the past on the show, I've discussed how this Pegasus software was used on Facebook users, and Facebook was suing the NSO group over it. It was used against Palestinian human rights organization groups. Somebody had used it to spy on the Saudi dissident Jamal Khashoggi, who was, of course, killed in the Saudi consulate in Turkey, his body dismembered by a team of Saudis, which, by the way, I was just reading today, The Guardian is reporting that 3 members of the kill team, including, people deeply involved, not, just some guy who drove the hit team there, which, that you're a part of the crime and everything. But, they're talking about the forensic expert who helped to dismember Jamal Khashoggi's body. They're talking about the guy who dressed in Jamal Khashoggi's clothes and then left the consulate in an attempt to make people believe that, he wasn't murdered there. And they're living in, I guess, very nice villas in Riyadh and just, being lavished. And this is, of course, in a country that, has beheaded activists who are under the age of 18 for, opposing the government and things like that. Absolutely unbelievable. Also, I did want to mention, I think I had said this on the show in the past, but I just wanted to make sure I said it again. There was a story in November that France had arrested somebody they said was a member of the Jamal Khashoggi hit team. But then a couple days later, they released the person, saying that it was a case of mistaken identity. And so I'm not sure exactly what's going on there. I feel like there's more of that story to be told, but I just wanted to mention that person was released and apparently not one of Jamal Khashoggi's assassins arrested in France. Let's see. Spyware also used on activists in Egypt and India, and on the phones in Egypt and India, there was also the Israeli spyware known as Cryots. I'm not sure. I don't have as much familiarity with this, but I've seen this name pop up several times, and so my guess is that it's going to continue to show up in the future. Also, U.S. Diplomats in Uganda had the Pegasus spyware on their phone, and so yeah, this has been a major scandal over the past couple of months. Again, mainly because Americans were targeted. Even the Jamal Khashoggi thing didn't get as much attention as you would think, as he was a Washington Post journalist who was killed and dismembered by a government. And Israel, in response to the U.S. sanctions of this whole scandal, has reduced the number of countries that it's going to export this technology to from 102 down to 37. 102, that's like half the countries on Earth apparently had access to this technology. I wasn't able to find a list either way on the countries still included, the countries excluded. I'm sure that, we could pretty easily slot 50 or so countries into one of the two categories as to, who got booted and who is definitely in. I'm sure the U.S. wasn't barred from having access to this, but they did report that Mexico, Morocco, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE were all on the list of countries that will no longer have access to technology from the NSO group. And I guess that probably extends beyond just the Pegasus software, but that is the main export. The other thing I want to mention on this was that the sanctions on the NSO group, and while, I don't recommend sanctions, they're economic warfare. At the same time, this is a semi-government agency that's exporting spyware to be used by governments all around the world on dissidents. It's really disturbing. So not really concerned about these sanctions, but those sanctions are apparently having a pretty big impact on the NSO group. And there's at least reports that it's having financial trouble. I'm not sure how, true all that is, trying to get the financial reports of a quasi-government spyware development agency. A lot of it is probably propaganda, but it could actually be in financial trouble. All right, so some other news on Israel, going with the West Bank first. This story from Haaretz detailing how the Shin Bet, an intelligence officer, the Shin Bet is Israel's intelligence agency, or one of them, and I guess maybe closer to FBI. Mossad would probably be more equivalent to the CIA. But anyways, this one of their intelligence officers, as a part of this group, provoked a 14-year-old boy. And so what happened here is you had 14-year-old Ahmed Abu Sultan, and he was killed by the IDF after lighting a Molotov cocktail, and then was shot from 5 to 10 feet away by an Israeli soldier at an upward angle, and it doesn't seem like there's any dispute that he was lighting a Molotov cocktail. The reason that this is disturbing, as I was saying, was disturbing about this case is what led this 14-year-old boy to be lighting the Molotov cocktail. Um, After he was killed, I guess his father went on his social media and found out that he was interacting with an Israeli intelligence officer who, wasn't like, reporting on like interacting with this boy, reporting on crimes, but was rather, saying antagonistic things in private messages to this young boy who, was responding, but you're a grown man. And so I think this really is a factor in why the kid was in a position to throw this Molotov cocktail. Now, I think it's bigger than just what this intelligence officer did as well. His parents were saying, and I've read about this before, that part of it's so ingrained in the culture that so many Palestinians end up going to an Israeli jail. I think I read reports that it's upwards of 50% total of Palestinians, that includes men and women, who at some time are put in an Israeli prison, and it's 25% of Palestinian women. So it's well over 50% of Palestinian men who has sometime been arrested by Israeli forces. And so there's something of a almost I don't want to say like a rite of initiation kind of ritual, but likely this is far more of a PTSD like response, where if all of your friends are getting in trouble and subjected to this kind of treatment, that you're going to put yourself in a kind of position to have that happen. And so even his parents are saying, like, he was out there to get arrested, and a lot of his friends had recently been arrested, right? And so they don't think that his real intent by throwing the Molotov cocktail was to hurt any of the soldiers or anything like that, but rather to be arrested, to like not just be with his friends, but to like be of the same status as his friends, to have that same shared experience as his friends. And I'm sure that again, that this probably has a lot to do with some like PTSD that the Palestinian children face growing up in the brutal Israeli occupation that they face in that apartheid state. So anyways, that's I guess most of the important details of this story, and just kind of wanted to bring that up, example here of what the occupation, what the apartheid state is doing to these Palestinian kids, and how it creates almost a narrative for the Israelis to say, look, these little kids are so violent, we have to gun them down. But really, it's the Israelis fostering that culture, and when they're not willing enough to go out there and harass Israeli soldiers, then the Israeli soldiers will harass the kids online until they go out there and puff out their chest and try to confront them in real life. And obviously the inappropriate thing going on is the adult attempting to troll the child on the internet. Absolutely disgusting. Then we have this also from Haaretz, a story of three young Palestinian boys who were accused, I believe, by the Israelis of throwing rocks or something trivial like that. The Israelis come to their homes at 10 p.m., which I'm sure is well past these young boys' bedtimes, and then they take them from their home and they drive them around for hours and hours. They don't really let them go to the bathroom as they need to. I think they made one of them like go to the bathroom outside at one point, but they also let them outside in very cold conditions for a few hours. Now, it doesn't seem like this was cold enough to cause any like health effects. It's not like the kids were going into hypothermia. However, this is unbelievable ways to treat preteens, right? And not that it would be acceptable to treat teenagers or even adults in this way, but to do it to, people who are clearly children, right? 11 years old isn't even, remotely, can't even, start to sprout chin hairs or anything like that. And so to do it to these young kids and, treat them worse than you would treat dogs is, again, just this whole culture of apartheid that you have in Israel. This is all a part of it and reinforces it into this generation of Palestinian kids when you do things like this to them. Have a report here from, I believe, Al Jazeera, going into abuse by Israeli guards at the Damon prison. This is a women prison. The reports say that there's been an uptick in threats, pepper spray, and using solitary confinement as a weapon. Now, a lot of people like to play down the solitary confinement issue, but, if you were thrown in solitary confinement arbitrarily or for breaking an arbitrary rule or something like that, I think pretty quickly you would see that it's a torture situation. Maybe 24 hours or something at a time for somebody who's acting too violently to be contained in any other way is one thing, but that's, not largely what we're talking about in these solitary confinement prisons. It's people who don't want to do like some kind of heavy work or dissent from the system in some way, or maybe they get in a little scuffle with a guard who was probably being pretty racist and disrespectful to them, and they say here removed prisoners' hijabs and pulled their hair, things like that. You end up in solitary confinement for a couple of weeks. It's a thing that could really do damage to someone's mind. And, I think John Kiriakou once, described solitary confinement as kind of like being in a parking spot that's about the size of it. I'm not quite sure if it's any different in Israel. I would only imagine, though, that it's probably worse. Some reporting here from the Washington Post, and they're actually reporting on numbers from the Israeli military. They say that cellular attacks on Palestinians have spiked 150% over the past 2 years. In the past year alone, the UN reports that 150 Palestinians have been attacked or otherwise beaten by settlers just in 2021 alone, with 4 fatalities. And again, this is only talking about settlers, and so this would be the West Bank. We're not talking about, say, any attacks by Israelis on Palestinian within Israel proper. Of course, I guess there's really no Israeli citizens getting into conflicts with Palestinians in Gaza, but the Palestinian or Israel kills a lot of Gazans. They just do more with their military. But as well as the attacks, the UN report also notes that there were 300 incidents of property destruction, including olive trees cut and burned during the autumn harvest. And so, imagine the kinds of things that you could do to people to really potentially like destroy their lives. Fruit trees would be like burning down somebody's home, right? Or olive trees, because they take, a few years to grow and get to the midpoint where they can mature and produce and everything like that. And so there's a lot of capital investment sunk into these olive trees, and I'm sure the families need them to maintain their homes and to continue living their lives and everything like that. And so when the settlers come and burn them down, are horrific kinds of crimes that we're talking about here. Now, I did want to mention that I've read quite a few reports in the past couple of weeks of what seems like basically tensions between the more civilian aspects of the Palestinian and the Israeli tensions increasing. Of course, we had this aggregate data coming from even the Israeli Defense Department about the increase in settler attacks, but we also have reports at least of individual incidents of Palestinians attacking, like say with knives or something, maybe at random members of the Israeli population, and that's also problematic and disturbing. And it seems maybe to be a result of the increase in overall violence against Palestinians over the past couple of years. Another thing I want to mention, there has been another one of these stories when you had an incident of a Palestinian man attack what appeared to be a completely innocent Israeli man. I don't know any background context between these two people, so maybe it wasn't a completely innocent attack, but at the same time, I didn't see any suggestion that it wasn't anything other than a Palestinian man attempting to murder an Israeli man at random. And he was able to stab the Israeli man. I don't think the Israeli man died, fortunately, and was stopped by Israeli security forces. They fired, and I think after he stabbed him, like, started running at the soldiers, and the soldiers put him down with a couple bullets. He was laying on the ground, but then the Israeli soldier executed him. Right. And so this is a disturbing thing that we've seen several times in Israel. This time it was actually endorsed, though, by the Israeli government as the kind of thing that they want to happen. And that's, kind of just the disturbing way that the Israeli government endorses the treatment and the killing of Palestinians. And Ramsey Brood has a fantastical article on that right now at antiwar.com if anybody wants to look on, how Israel justifies legally the killing of Palestinians. Let's see. We also have human rights groups saying that Israel failed to investigate the shootings that killed more than 200 Palestinians and wounded thousands others at protests along the Gazan frontier in recent years. These are protests that we are first covering on the Foreign Policy Focus podcast, now, of course, on conflicts of interest. Just how Israel gunning down people, including medics, children, people bound to wheelchairs. All these people were gunned down by Israel. Israel says, they're counting all their bullets, they're killing them with snipers and everything like that. It's not, it's not that the kid was killed by a ricochet, or that the kid was, had a gun and was attempting to shoot Israeli soldiers through the fence, or anything remotely like that. We're talking about children, young children, hundreds of feet away from the border. We're talking about medics, scores of feet away from the actual border, if not more, with their backs turned, being gunned down, marked as medics, and in no way trying to just, take people who had already been shot by the Israeli military, move them away. And that's who Israel was gunning down these protests, and there's no investigation into it. Nobody's going to be held responsible. It was just an absolute slaughter of civilians in the most disgusting way. And it was absolutely publicly available for anybody to watch. You could go out there, anybody Google Great Return March protests, and just see Israeli soldiers gun down Palestinians. And of course, if you have any objection to the U.S. giving Israel billions of dollars in military aid, well then, the U.S. mainstream narrative is always, you just do that because you don't like Jewish people. Which is, of course, the just biggest lie ever. Let's see. We also have Palestinians facing increased home demolition in 2020, 2021. This is an overall increase or high for over a 5-year period. There were 797 demolition orders given in this past year. Of course, a lot of people around the world are in places where they say it's absolutely unacceptable to evict anybody from their home during a pandemic, and the Israelis are not only evicting Palestinians from their homes, but they're tearing them down or giving them to either settlers. I guess they're not necessarily Israelis. I mean, you could be coming from New York and claim the ability to settle in Israel in a Palestinian home, and they're just giving them away. This data also shows that of 2,550 requests for construction permits by Palestinians between 2016 and 2020, only 24 of them were granted. 0.9%. And of course, if that few are granted, I'm guessing that a lot of people don't even bother applying. And so there would be thousands and thousands of more Palestinians looking to build, but are prevented. And of course, only 24 of them were able to do it legally. This is also why when people say, well, Israel is just tearing down different buildings that didn't have permits in the first place, it's because it's impossible for Palestinians to get permits, that they have to build without them. Israel is planning to build 6 new settlements in Palestinian neighborhoods in East Jerusalem. I'm sure that this will lead to confrontations if Israel moves forward with these plans. Some of these neighborhoods are near the Damascus Gate, which is, I believe, the part of the boundary of the Arab or Muslim sector of Jerusalem, and then also near Sheikh Jarrah, which is an area that has kicked off a lot of protest already and confrontation, and part of what led to the escalation and the fighting between Gaza and Israel in May of this past year. Israel is also planning to double the number of settlers in the Golan Heights. And while, there are Palestinians here who I'm sure will lose out, this is an annexation of Syrian territory, and Syria is unhappy with this. Of course, Israel says we really don't care, and has carried out probably thousands now. We could probably easily well be over 1,000, maybe even to the multi-thousands, Israel airstrikes in Syria over the past 10 years. And Israel says they had no plans of slowing that down. Will continue that air war in Syria through 2022. Let's see. Israel completes its border wall with Gaza. This is a multi-billion-dollar wall. It is not chain link, but fence at least, and if not concrete barrier overhead, and it also digs deep into the ground and it extends out into the sea. Surveillance cameras everywhere. Some of the equipment, I believe, is like, I don't know, autonomous weapons, but they're the Israelis are in the command and control center, and then the guns are mounted on like the walls and things like that, and so they're able to fire at Palestinians and kill protesters or whatever they want to do without even remotely putting themselves in any kind of possible even line of sight with the Palestinians. So yeah, massive wall going up around Gaza. This is basically a giant prison wall, because Gaza is essentially a giant prison camp. Homes in Gaza are coming down as a result of the Israel air war in May. And, a lot of the calculations, I guess, at the time in May that were considering how many people were displaced and dishomed by the Israeli war, counted the buildings that Israel destroyed. But when you bomb and destroy, multi-story, 10, 15-story, and maybe 15 is a little high, but buildings, office buildings and things like that in Gaza, then the buildings next door are going to be, in some cases, damaged so severely that they're also going to have to be brought down as well. And so there's been several buildings that have been torn down since even the destruction of May, from the Israeli airstrikes, because if you drop a 500-pound bomb in the middle of a city or something like that, a lot more than just the initial home that was destroyed likely needs significant repairs or to be torn down completely. In the past week, this happened after Christmas. I think December 28th was the actual date of the event. There was a Israeli military contractor working and doing some maintenance work, as Israeli describes it, on the fence. Now, this guy, I guess, could have been his maintenance work, equipping a gun or something like that. But it was reported that contractor worker was lightly injured by gunfire, and no idea who fired it. Israel responded with artillery fire and is reported to have injured 3 Palestinians, farmers, so civilians. Unclear, I guess, if this is just like a one-off event or if this is something that could escalate into a larger conflict, as we have seen in the past between Israel and Gaza. Some other news on Israel. Israel is denying the UAE the ability to dock tankers at their Red Sea port. This was something that Israel and the UAE had initially agreed to, that I guess Israel has now walked back on. The U.S. is donating I think, here we go. The U.S. is donating $99 million to the UN Relief and Work Agency. This is the agency that provides services to 5 million Palestinians. And one of the reasons I wanted to mention this is, I'm sure the relief agency does some good work, helps some Palestinians, and, prevents some Palestinians from living either in worse poverty or, from dying, making sure kids get the medicine they need, get the nutrition they need and all that. And so I'm not saying that it's a terrible thing to donate money, to the UN Relief Work Agency and the Palestinians or something like that, especially as involved as the U.S. is in, making the Palestinians this poor and contributing to so much to their suffering. Even though, I'm not a huge fan of international aid, and I'll explain why more in a second. But if the U.S. was going to do this, take the money away from what you were going to give, like the Israeli military or something like that, right? Anyways, one of the reasons that it's so disturbing is the UN agency really prevents its employees, which are largely Palestinians, from speaking out on the Palestine issue. And in one sense, you can maybe understand this, that if all of your employees are very outspoken or something like that, it could cut donations that you're getting. But at the same time, if this is essentially the Palestinian Relief Agency, and the Palestinians who are probably English speakers end up there disproportionately and things like that, are no longer able to speak out for the Palestinian cause, it's going to really prevent and hamper the Palestinian movement. And it's just, one of the nefarious things that happens with foreign aid. We have the state of Illinois barring its pension fund from investing in Unilever. This is the parent company of Ben & Jerry's, and is over the decision by Ben & Jerry's to not sell ice cream in West Bank settlements. I can't believe that this is still an issue a year later, that they're still pushing this, but it does show the success and the influence of the Israel lobby in the United States, that they're, punishing U.S., well, I guess formerly U.S. I don't think Unilever's a U.S. company, but Ben & Jerry's is, and has factories in the U.S. and everything like that. And Ben & Jerry's is being punished by American governments, these American state governments, over their decision about a foreign country. Absolutely absurd. And Israel, it was announced, will go ahead and start to give a fourth vaccine dose for vulnerable people. I guess this is 60 plus. They also had talked about healthcare workers in an article I read. Initially, it was reported that Israel was going to move forward with the fourth dose. And then about a week ago, it was, I guess, clarified to say that Israel was going forward with looking into giving a fourth dose. But now it seems that they're going full steam ahead with a fourth dose at this time. All right, so that's all the news I have on Israel. There's a lot that I had, missed on the past month, but a lot of what we have on the show and talk about on the show when it comes to Israel is discussed, when we talk about Syria or, the Iran nuclear deal talks, which Israel is heavily involved in, even if they're not actually a part of the Iran nuclear deal.